Okay, we usually do get good units, and we get great units, and sometimes we get really busted units, but Panette is actually broken in the literal sense, because she crashes your game. It's not the first time that we've had a unit that crashes the entire game. Ashera did that before with her attacking animation, and I don't remember the exact details, but basically she entered combat and it was basically just completely broken. It just did not work. You had to play with animations off, otherwise you were pretty much screwed on that front. Panette's is actually really interesting because it requires one specific skill to get going, and if you didn't see in the thumbnail, I'm gonna show it on the screen right now. That's right, baby. In order to completely break the game, you need to kill one brave Alphonse to her for reopening. And you might be sitting there wondering why reopening of all skills is affecting Panette in this way, and does it apply to everything else? To be quite frank, we don't know exactly why it's not working with Panette, but we do know how it triggers. And there's a lot of ways to get this off, both in the benefit of the player, which I'll get into later, and more to the detriment of the opponent. Maybe sometimes you, but that'll wholly depend. The big thing that you'll need to know about Panette and reopening is that this only works with her Berserker Axe PRF. You could use this with pretty much any other inheritable, but if you do use it with her PRF and reopening at the same time, it will more than likely crash the game. And it all ties back to the battle forecast. And I think this is where it's going to get really tricky, because the most we were able to boil it down, and I'm saying we because a bunch of us just kind of tested it out in a Discord voice chat, but currently the assumption is based around her true damage that she gets a lot of just from the weapon, but she also gets it from the B slot. This is the first iteration of a skill that does give you true damage based on your own stats, whereas we've had something like Assassin Strike and Occultist Strike that calculates off the foe. At least through means that are right out of the gate and not reliant on a special. We've had Godlike Reflexes and Lagoo's Friend this year, and those do scale off your own stats, but those never led to any crashes with Panette. Only reopening, and initially we thought it could apply based on the foe, but after testing it out, it just works perfectly fine, and I think it's just because it's two different forms of true damage, where you're getting one based on the foe and based on yourself, which is probably why it's causing the issue. I don't think it's anything related to the amount of stats she could get based on the foe's attack, because it was tested with other characters that have similar effects, and none of the crashes did apply in that regard, only on Panette, which is what's leading me to believe that it's based on the true damage gimmick in her weapon clashing with whatever is potentially coming out of the B slot. I can't say it's definitively the case, and it could also relate to the fact that she also gets extra true damage based on missing HP, something similar to a Wayne, but we haven't tested that mostly because it's extremely expensive, and I don't think most people are going to have an Owain with reopening. Regardless, we just didn't have the ability to test that, which only opens up the case for whether or not it also crashes with Owain. It's kind of debatable, but also it works based on his own special, so there's probably a bit more to consider, but regardless, the underlying issue is that as long as her PRF is active and the condition is met, and if reopening is also active, then it will crash the game. And it can work in a lot of ways that isn't really the best. Great example, by the way. If you just have the foe initiate onto her, it will completely crash the game. And you don't necessarily have to have her attack. It's weird how the AI kind of prioritizes itself because it's based on just battle forecast, which is mostly under the hypothetical scenario where Panette can actually go in and deal damage. Even if they aren't able to in a single combat or that turn, as long as the possibility does exist and they already have their eyes set on a character they're aiming for, they will crash the game. And it may sound a bit weird or complicated or you don't really understand, but that's just essentially what phase AI is. Speaking of which, if you have Panette in an AI setting, even if it's through your own control, they will crash the game. That is crash number 2, I believe. Yeah, and it gets a bit more complicated on that front because there are other means and checks that can make it so she does end up crashing the game even if she isn't at the point where she could actively enter combat combat. For example, if you were to put her on an Aether Raid's defense team, if she starts moving, it doesn't matter if she enters combat or she has the ability to get hit, anything that is directly interacting with the battle forecast will crash the game. Now, one thing I also want to mention is that you could have her in the corner where she's basically just doing nothing. If she's trapped in there and there's no way for her to move around or go and attack a unit in some scenario, then it won't really do anything, even if you just end up attacking anybody. But if you have no way to get rid of either of her conditions, then it won't really matter at the end of the day because it'll still end up being a loss on your end. But that's where it gets fun because her weapon is mostly enemy phase oriented with the condition that the foe has 75% HP if they decide to initiate. So you can still work around this in some capacity. You know, maybe step on a bolt trap or take damage in basically any other regard. You can pretty much circumvent the issue, but, and I'm not going to say I'm advocating for this, but you could theoretically, hypothetically, well, not hypothetically, it does work, but you could, if you really wanted to, still have her in the corner of an Aether Raid's defense map and have her completely screw over the opponent based on two factors, both of which are completely obtainable. The first one being Celica Emblem, and this one's much more on the nose and will probably get you completely screwed over if you have no idea how to deal with it. And generally, I don't think you're going to be able to deal with it unless you're just really quick about it. If she's able to reach you, even in the corner, because it's a 5-space warp, it will completely ruin your Aether Raid's match. It's somewhat deceptive because the range doesn't really show until you enter it, so it can be something that takes you off guard. But there is a second thing you can do that makes it completely messed up, even beyond Celica Emblem, and it's putting her on a map where she can reach a breakable block, because that ensures that she has a target in mind. If she tries to move and act and break a block, that will also crash the game, because at that point she's still able to hypothetically reach a unit, even if she doesn't end up dealing any damage at the end of the day, just because she can theoretically get around every single barrier in her way. It's pretty messed up because usually you would just kind of leave that unit alone, but you could throw her on this Aether Raid's map and it will just completely go off if you kill any unit and the AI starts moving. If anything, it is kind of interesting because it does show the priorities of the AI. If they are able to reach in some hypothetical scenario, even if they are able to run out of turns or anything, just as long as the AI is shown to be able to reach any opponent, it will do background combat checks against pretty much every single unit on the field and then go from there. It's really interesting, and there's a lot of other stuff regarding the AI that really is taken into account, but it does show its priorities on that front. Now, I will mention though that if you do have a pre-charged AoE special and it does enough damage to knock her out of the 25% HP range, then it won't actually crash the game. You'll still be able to see the battle forecast and it will just continue as normal. But I wouldn't say it's particularly realistic a lot of the time to just come prepared with an AoE, and I don't think most people are going to do it here because there's a good chance this will get fixed, hopefully sooner rather than later, because this also extends beyond Aether Raids. This will pretty much work everywhere, and it's not really avoidable at the moment. Some people will probably just end up throwing Alphonse's entire kit onto Panette just because it scores well, and she's the brand new Grail that scores pretty well, so there's a good chance that's also possible. But I want to talk about the one that's really concerning to me personally, and I think it's going to be concerning to a lot of people who play Summoner Duels, and it's that this can completely screw over matches, extending even beyond the favor battles, which is pretty much a no stakes mode. This can go into the competitive modes of SDR and SDS, and it's already a problem in Aether Raids if it just so happens to be implemented. In Summoner Duels, there are plenty of clauses that can make it work both for the player and against the player. The first one being similar to basically every other mode, and it's if you check the battle forecast against Panette, you can pretty much have Panette teleport in with Celica Ring or Guidance or anything, and as long as the conditions of her weapon and PRF are active, then there's really nothing they could possibly do against it unless they have a pre-charged AoE or some dedicated counter. It doesn't matter if she can counter or not, as long as there is a battle forecast active, they will crash. This also applies against auto battles if you just are running out against a timer, which can also be a bit of an issue, although I would say the former is much more applicable, but it's still something worth considering nonetheless. This also works vice versa for the Panette player itself. If it just so happens that they auto battle or they check the forecast against any player with Panette, then it will also crash them. You do get a 30-second timer to come back after disconnecting, but if it happens multiple times, then it will continue from where it left off to the point where you can pretty much just get free wins under the right circumstance. It's kind of messed up in a lot of ways, and I mean, I'm hoping this is a really quick patch. I don't really know how long these types of things take to implement, but there's a good chance it could just completely ruin the mode and the event for that entire week. But again, it really just depends how fast they get it out. I'm sure if enough feedback is thrown their way, they'll get it in and out as soon as possible, and maybe the best case scenario is that in the events that it did affect some players, they'll just get max rewards, which would honestly be pretty cool. But really, the big thing you have to consider is if you give Panette reopening and she's using her PRF, as long as the HP condition on reopening is active, as well as Panette's PRF being active, and any battle calculation happens, it will crash the game. This includes battle forecasts either from her or the opponent, and if you are able to manipulate it in some way, then you can kind of just glitch your way up to the top ranks. And you know, this also includes any battle calculation that will presumably happen with AI in general. You know how some AI will aim for certain units if they think it's probably going to be their best matchup, or maybe it's because it's close in proximity? It's basically just how they are able to determine where they move, and that will also affect whether the game does crash. But really what you need to take away from that is basically any AI movement will crash the game if reopening is active. It's kind of funny, but also kind of messed up if a lot of people start to abuse it. My hope is that enough feedback will be sent to IS so they end up fixing it as soon as possible. This can be pretty problematic, and maybe the main takeaway is that Alphonse should not have won CYL. Okay, don't crucify me for that one, but it is kind of funny, and yeah, I guess by technicality, Panette is currently the most broken unit in the game. Whether you want to take that literally or she's tier Omega 0, that's up to you.